This is A Word, a podcast from Slate. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. It's Women's History Month, and for centuries, Black women have been erased from key moments in American history. But they've been freedom fighters from the beginning, often participating and even leading revolts against slavery.
I hope people understand how history is actually a weapon, so you better arm yourself with knowledge.
More on the book Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, coming up on A Word with me, Jason Johnson. Stay tuned.
This episode is brought to you by Visit Williamsburg. In Williamsburg, Virginia, there's never too much of a good thing. Whether you're a foodie, a golfer, a history buff, a shopaholic, an outdoor enthusiast, or a thrill seeker, you'll find what you came for here and more. So ask yourself, what is it you want? Discover Williamsburg and plan your trip at visitwilliamsburg.com.
Does Monday at the office feel like a storm? Not with Microsoft Copilot. That feeling when Copilot gets everyone up to speed instantly? It's sunny again. When Copilot simplifies complex data so your teams can act, that sun's shining on a beach. And when Copilot uncovers hidden insights, you're on that beach with your people, and you find buried treasure. That's Microsoft Copilot. Learn more at Microsoft.com/AI for all.
Welcome to A Word, a podcast about race and politics and everything else. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. March is Women's History Month, and we thought it would be a great opportunity to talk about a book that takes a unique approach to exploring the role of Black women in American history. It's called Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. It combines historical narratives with illustrations depicting African and African-American women rising up against their enslavers, often at the cost of their own lives. Wake also tells the story of its author, historian, attorney, and educator Rebecca Hall, and her quest to bring these narratives forward after centuries of suppression and neglect. Hall spent countless hours combing through historical records in the United States and Great Britain, often piecing together the stories of these women from documents that depicted them as less than human. Hall has described the process as emotionally demanding and, at points, joyful. She joins us now. Dr. Rebecca Hall, welcome to A Word.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm so excited about this. I'm working on a graphic novel myself, so I was researching other academics who had done graphic novels, and I stumbled upon yours, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. How have I not heard of this before? So I'm very excited to have this conversation. This book is so fascinating, not just the material, but sort of how you approached it. What inspired you to write a book about women-led slave revolts? What made you want to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of women warriors and fighting back and slave resistance is something that's always intrigued me. I think being a Black woman, I always believed that women's fighting was being erased. And I kept seeing it when I was researching. So, like I read every book on every slave revolt. Within the first 10 pages, like in the introduction, or the first chapter, there was like this statement always like, of course we know that women weren't involved in this type of resistance, of, organized acts of violence. That's a masculine activity. And I'm like, why is everybody saying the same sentence over and over and over again? Because I'm actually very interested in historiography, right? Which is how history is written, how we're taught to frame our understandings of things. And so it became not just an archival research project and all of that work, but a big historiographical intervention.
One of the things of the literally dozens of things about this book that I took notes on that I was amazed by is you have a section where you're talking about the revolts of enslaved people during the Middle Passage. And you literally have it in a narrative dialogue box that the greater percentage of women on the ship, the more likely there was to be a revolt. Why did that happen? And how did you discover that?
Okay, so first of all, I was not the one who discovered that. When the internet got started and historians were like, oh, I study this transatlantic slave trade. So do I. Let's create a new thing called a database, right? So the transatlantic slave trade database, which is free and available on the internet, has now records of 36,000 slave ship voyages, and it's searchable. And so the lead scholars on that, they were the ones who, well, first of all, found that there was a documented revolt on 1 in 10 ships, which surprised everyone because it's a pretty suicidal act. And so the numbers were surprising, but then they're like, oh, and then so then we looked at the ships that had revolts and didn't have revolts. And the only thing that was of any statistical difference was that the more women on the ship, the more likely to be a revolt. And then they immediately dismissed their own findings in their own article, saying, but we know that women did not engage in this type of resistance, so we don't know what's going on here. So then I spent, months and months in the UK looking through slave captains' logs, right? I mean, I ended up doing like deep dive into insurance. Lloyd's of London got their start insuring slave ships. That's why there's documentation of revolt, because they would buy a policy against the insurrection of cargo. And so they would have to document what happened. While the ship was gathering and loading captives, everyone was brought below deck and kept chained because there was a problem of cutoffs. So people who were trying to fight and free the captives from the shore literally cut off ships and rescued people. And so to prevent that from happening, they kept everyone down chained below. And then as soon as the ship, got into the deep Atlantic, the women were unchained and put on deck where the weapons are. And the reason, it's about sexual abuse. When you ask sort of what inspired me or what fired me up, I don't know if you're familiar with Angela Davis's article that she wrote while she was in solitary confinement for a year in 1972, I think it was, called Black Women in the Community of Slaves. Because there's an incredible violence that happens in the historiography of slavery and slave resistance. I mean, because when slave resistance was first being written about post-slavery, the institution of slavery in this country, the story was there was no resistance because slavery in the United States was a benign and civilizing institution. And that was literally the what you would learn until you went to school, like maybe in the late 60s, early 70s, you start getting Black people into the academy recovering these stories. At the same time, there's this whole discourse, I don't know if about, the Moynihan Report and how the reason why Black people are in such trouble is because their family systems are pathological, because their women are matriarchal. And this gender role deformity was created during slavery and hampers the Black community to this day. The historiography of reclaiming revolt happened in that context. If you pick up Jordan Roll, or any of these classic ones, you will find right in there, of course, women didn't undermine their men by participating in blah, 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 blah. And then, when you get women's in the 80s and you start getting women's history and feminist history and Black women writing beautiful history, and they conceded the ground. They're like, okay, if it's true that women didn't participate in revolt, their acts were just as heroic, individual, perhaps less confrontational, whatever, and we need to celebrate that type of resistance. And I'm like, yes, I'm all for celebrating that type of resistance. You do that. Don't concede the ground.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more on Wake, the hidden history of women-led slave revolts. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned. This is Jason Johnson, host of A Word, Slate's podcast about race and politics and everything else. I want to take a moment to welcome our new listeners. If you've discovered A Word and like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And let us know what you think by writing us at aword@slate.com. Thank you.
This new year, it's time to do wellness on your terms. That's where Ollie comes in. Thanks to their delightful gummies, you can actually get a good night's sleep. And you might finally stand a chance of staying focused. Because this is the year of you. Discover Ollie vitamins and supplements. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Shipping can make or break a sale, so optimize how you ship your orders with ShipStation. They make it easy to automate and manage orders no matter how big your business grows. And they might even be able to help reduce shipping and warehouse costs. So optimize and keep up your momentum for growth with ShipStation. Sign up for your free 60-day trial now at ShipStation.com and use the code POD. That's ShipStation.com with the code POD.
You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking about Wake, the hidden history of women-led slave revolts with historian and author Rebecca Hall. So, Dr. Hall, what made you want to put this in graphic novel form? Most people, I want it to be written in a book, or maybe even they go straight to a documentary. What made you say the graphic novel is the best way to present this?
It was a weird thought, but I'm a fan of the medium, but I never in a million years thought I would be creating one. When I finally was like, I need to walk away from academia because I keep getting fired, I wanted to figure out a way to take the story that I put so much of my blood, sweat, and tears in and make it accessible to people who would be interested in the story. And as a teacher, I have taught with comics. I was at Tulane and, in New Orleans, Tulane African Diaspora Department has a partnership with all the high schools. So they have a Black high school reading book club. And they bought 300 copies for Wake and invited me there. And I met with all these, and there's this 10th grader who was like, Dr. Hall, usually comics are about superheroes. Like, who's the superhero in your book? And I'm like, Black people. And then they burst into applause. And I don't know if you've ever, because I've taught high school. I've taught everything from high school to law school. High school is my favorite. I love teaching high school. But they never spontaneously clap, So I'm like, wow. And so I think people are now getting it, that this medium is one that maintains the complexity of the material without dumbing it down.
So for the audience, for clarity, there have been several public intellectuals, writers, academics, and scholars who've taken their work and put it in graphic novel form lately. There's John Lewis, who had Run and March. He took his life story. Ibram Kendi turned Stand from the Beginning into a graphic novel. Roxane Gay has written graphic novels. So it is sort of the cutting edge of sort of a lot of scholarly work now. Dr. Hall, not only did you create a graphic novel, but after it blew up and people were interested in it all around the world, there was an audio book or audio drama about it.
Wait for our signal. I don't know. We will die here. We are dead already, Adele. At least we will die together. Hong Tong Chi. In unity.
How did that come about? Who approached you and said, oh my God, I love this story. How are we going to make this?
Yeah, so that was an insane story. The book had been turned into Simon & Schuster, and it was going to be out in 8 months. And I was doing research on a second graphic narrative on Reconstruction. I had a residency at the Schomburg, at the height of the pandemic. It was crazy. But anyway, I got contacted by this company called Podium, and they do audio books and plays. And normally what they do is they find independent author who self-publishes. This was a unique opportunity for them because Simon & Schuster did not reserve the audio rights. Because why would you have audio rights for a graphic narrative? And so they're like, oh, wow, okay, we want to engage with more serious subject matter. And so I just got contacted by them. I'm like, oh yeah, sure, whatever. And every 3 months or so, I would meet with this incredible young Black woman who was the playwright. And then suddenly it went into production, and it's been incredible. And what I learned in that process is that the graphic narrative is a medium, but there are a lot of other mediums that I'm interested in bringing this story to. I've been working on creating Wake Productions. So to bring all of this stuff in-house, because I'm constantly being turned to come lecture here. I design curriculum for the state of New York. I am doing another comic for them right now on the founder of Harvard Law, who was a slave trader. So there's a lot of things where I feel like, okay, you tried to keep me from being an educator. Well, I can do this with scholarly rigor and make it accessible.
What did you discover as a through line about women-led revolts against enslavement? Where did these start? What did you find was sort of a consistent theme about these kinds of revolts?
As a historian, I feel really uncomfortable making some big brand synthesis claims. So I focused on New York City in 1700. When I was doing some initial research, I came across a letter that drew me to a revolt in 1712 in New York, but all the history books written about it kept saying the men, the Coromantee men. I mean, the reason also I picked New York is because, trying to intervene in this idea that, slavery was this like Southern plantation thing, but slavery was formative to the city of New York. It didn't even become illegal till 1829. I mean, Wall Street was a wall built by enslaved people to protect the Dutch and then the English from indigenous folks who were like, what are you doing on our land? In the 1700s, a fifth of the population was enslaved.
One of the other things that I find interesting when I was reading your book is the challenges that you faced as a researcher. You were denied access to a library in New York on some just absolute nonsense. You went to Lloyd's of London and confronted them, and they didn't want to let you in. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges you faced, at least in those two instances of even trying to do research on this book.
I was expecting resistance because I had spoken to colleagues who have also been denied access to their archives, right? Lloyd's of London is a private insurance company. Their archives are private. They can make whatever decisions they want about who can access them and who can't. And I describe it in the book where it's like, so you are actually forbidding me from researching your insurrection of cargo insurance policies. But if I were here researching the rise of the reinsurance industry in the 20th century or whatever, you would let me in. And they're like, yes. That was like 20 years ago, right? I got my PhD in 2004. And so I got contacted by Lloyd's of London in 2020, that little brief period of, it's over, whatever it was, racial reckoning. And they're like, okay, we hired somebody to go, to review our materials to see if we have any racist artifacts. And I'm like, an artifact? I want to see your insurance policies.
I want to ask this, oftentimes when you're doing research, and especially something as difficult as the history of enslaved women, because you're dealing with the emotional violence, you're dealing with the mental violence, you're dealing with sexual violence, you're dealing with trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma. Was there ever a point during this research, putting together Wake, where you thought, okay, I'm done, or maybe I can't finish this, or you needed to get help, like psychological, emotional, spiritual help to finish? Did you ever reach that point?
All of those points. And I literally, I called on my grandmother. There is a huge generation skip in my family. So my paternal grandparents were born enslaved. Okay. I just turned 61. My grandmother was born on a plantation in Missouri in 1860. And my grandfather was born on the Hall farm in Tennessee in 1860. Right. Of course, I never met them. Right. I have this one picture of my grandmother, and I just put it by my computer because it was the writing up part. And I felt like I was bleeding from the inside. And then I'm like, yeah, you survived this. I can survive researching it.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more about the graphic narrative book, Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts with author Rebecca Hall. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned.
At a time when information continues to come at us faster and faster, sometimes you need to hit pause and rewind. NPR's Throughline takes you back in time to the source of the news stories filling your feed. Find NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking with Rebecca Hall about her graphic narrative, Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. So, Dr. Hall, there are several, obviously you went through archives, this country, outside of the country. What's one woman-led slave revolt that really struck you, either because of the ingenuity behind it, the impact of it, the challenge to discover it? What's one that really stuck out to you?
So this is a really hard question for me because they all do. It's similar to a question I get where it's like, can you describe a slave revolt that was successful? I'm like, they all were. So I don't know how to answer that question, but the New York City 1712 revolt, I think for me, it stands out because of how I entered into the topic, where again, every book written, it's not like, there's like 2 articles in a book, like there's not a lot written about it, but was like, there were no women involved. You can go to the African burial ground exhibit and they'll say like, the men who did this revolt. It's just everywhere. It's just erasure, constant erasure, And I think that the fact, like going back to Angela Davis's, I like to call it her ovarian work on, Black women in the community of slaves, that no, we're not walking 10 steps behind. This is our truth. We fought for this.
You found, I believe it was the revolt of the 1700s. There were 4 names, and it was and there were 4 different women. Can you tell us a little bit about those 4 women and that revolt, and the fact that not all of them were punished the same way? Not all of them necessarily got punished.
When you're doing this kind of history from the bottom up, right? If you're going to try to reclaim Black women's subjectivity in 1700 in New York, you have to read against the grain. It's a skill, right? Like I had the names, like it was Sarah, Abigail, Amba, and Lily were tried. A bunch got away. 3 women committed suicide before capture. And then these 4 women were tried. And all I could find about them, I had to go through their so-called owners. So I spent months at the New York Historical Society going through endless probate records of these slavers. And one of the things that I did in the book that was really kind of scary, but I feel like I did it principled, was when the record fell completely silent. I said, okay, here I am going to tell a story of what absolutely positively could have happened, but I'm not saying that it did. And I'm marking it. It's starting here and ending here. And so then I use all of my knowledge and intellect and throw it at this situation. And then I'm like, oh, I didn't think of the visual research part. So I'm like, having to find out all about, these skilled trades and then these networks of communication. It's just fascinating. Looking through the laws, you can see before and after and get a sense of what was impacting the society and what was being pushed back against.
So these 4 women were part of the 1712 revolt, and they were tried separately from the men, but you say some escaped.
No, there were 29 enslaved people who were captured and then tried. What we know about it is mainly from the colonial governor's correspondence at the time. And so we know that Sarah and Abigail were both convicted and Lily and Amba were both acquitted. I have the trial record. It's literally like crumbling fragments of paper. They would say like, well, when saying for herself, no more than she had previously said, we find her guilty and we sentence her to be burned at the stake. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to go back and look at what she previously said, because this is handwritten on parchment. I could have missed stuff and it's literally not there. So it's like there's this incredible book called Silencing the Past by Michel Rolfe-Trio. One of the things he says is like, you think when you're getting a chronicle of the event, you're going to get all the information, but any chronicle is just still what's considered relevant. So what motivated Sarah in that moment? Why Amba wasn't convicted in that moment? The state has to pay money for enslaved people who are executed. They have to reimburse the owners because otherwise there would be no motivation to report criminal behavior. And it's not really clear, but what's really frustrating to me is I never found out one of the women was hung and the other was held because she was pregnant. And the idea was she'd be executed after she gave birth. Because I think for religious reasons and also that baby belonged to somebody's property, right? And I still don't know which one it was. Was it Sarah? Was it Abigail? I don't know.
What is something that you want an audience member right now to take from Wake? There's somebody right now who's listening to the podcast and they're like, hey, I'm going to go find this on Amazon. I'm going to go to a black bookstore. I'm going to pick this up. I'm going to download it somewhere. What do you want them to take from the work? Do you want them to be inspired? Do you want them to be moved? Do you want them to say, oh my gosh, I want this in my local community college? What do you want the impact of your work to be on people?
I want them to take from this experience. They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. I am all for Black joy. There is joy in resistance, in honoring the sacrifices of the people who got us here. That's what I'm interested in. I hope people understand how history is actually a weapon. So you better arm yourself with knowledge.
Historian Rebecca Hall is the author of Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. Rebecca, this has been one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had in a long time. Thank you so very much for your work and coming on A Word.
Thank you for having me.
And that's A Word for this week. The show's email is aword@slate.com. This episode was produced by Kristie Taiwo-Makanjuola. Ben Richmond is Slate's Senior Director of Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is the Vice President of Slate Audio. Our theme music was produced by Don Will. I'm Jason Johnson. Tune in next week for A Word.